But yeah, good morning to everybody. Welcome to the latest in our Rhetoric to Reality webinar series. So we've had a good range of different topics, I think, in our webinar series so far, and this is the final one in the current series. So we are hoping to revive the series at some point after a quick review. And the context is obviously the Hollywood election coming up as well. So it's just really trying to get people really thinking a lot more about policy issues in the current context, particularly our members, our social enterprise members. So the webinar today is Financial Freedom for All, and it's about minimum income guarantee and universal basic income and related issues. So we're really keen on hearing your views around this topic when we come to the discussion. So if you want to post any questions or comments anytime throughout the webinar, please post in the chat. But obviously you can come on camera when we come to that part and ask your question on camera as well. We have 4 speakers today, and I will hand over to our first speaker without further delay, and that is Ruth Boyle from the Poverty Alliance. Ruth.
Thank you, Duncan, and thanks so much, Andy, for sharing my slides as well. Hi, everyone. My name's Ruth Boyle. I'm the Policy and Campaigns Manager at the Poverty Alliance. I've been invited along today to talk about the minimum income guarantee. This is the Poverty Alliance's overarching policy call, particularly as we build to the Scottish Parliament elections. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that policy means and some of the work that we've been doing in that space. Could I get the next slide there, Andy? Thank you. So for anyone who hasn't encountered the Poverty Alliance before, we're Scotland's anti-poverty network. We're a membership organisation. We have over 400 civil society members, and that ranges from small grassroots community groups to large national NGOs, academic institutions, trade unions, and faith groups. And together we try to influence policy and practice with the ultimate aim of building a Scotland free from poverty. So my job there is to lead our policy, our campaigning, and our communications work. Next slide there, Andy. Thank you. So before I go into the detail of the minimum income guarantee, I think it's really important to ground ourselves in the current picture. So we know that people in Scotland believe that everyone should have access to a decent life, free from the injustice of poverty, inequality, and financial insecurity. But more and more of us feel that we're on shaky ground. Our incomes never seem enough to cover the basics for a decent life. And many of us are struggling to pay our bills, heat our homes, or even buy enough to eat. And we see that reality playing out in our poverty and inequality statistics, and we know that we're not making enough progress here. So Scotland's not currently on track to meet our legally binding child poverty targets. We see a trend for deepening poverty, both in Scotland and across the UK. And we also know that there's a heightened risk of poverty for particular groups of people, like women, disabled people, and Black and minority ethnic people. Next slide. And for us at the Poverty Alliance, the policy solution that has emerged in response to these issues is the minimum income guarantee. Now, this is a policy idea centred on the idea of setting a solid income floor below which nobody would be allowed to fall. So that's a minimum level of income. And this progresses the idea of financial security for all of us, because all of us can encounter unexpected life events like losing your job, having your working hours reduced, a bereavement. And that would mean that you no longer have the income that you need to reach that dignified level of life. And the minimum income guarantee would mean that we all have a right to a minimum standard of living, whatever life throws at us. And we see that there's been a number of principles developed as part of the work to look at a minimum income guarantee. And those are a guaranteed level of income that's yours by right. And it's a minimum income level set at such to ensure that you have an acceptable standard of living that promotes dignity and a decent quality of life. So here you see some overlap with the universal basic income that we'll hear from Cleo on. Sometimes Cleo and I are pitched against each other to fight to the death for these policies, but actually we think that there's a lot of overlap in the principles that undermine them and think that we can work together to promote those principles. But where we see deviation between those two policies is that the minimum income guarantee is not a flat payment in the way that the UBI is. So rather, it's designed to take into account the distinct needs of individuals or families. So that would look, for example, at the number of children in a household. Is there a disabled person in the household, which we know pushes up the cost of living? And in that way, we think that the minimum income guarantee is more clearly focused on tackling poverty and inequality in Scotland. Next slide, Andy. Thank you. Now, you might think when you hear those principles that this is just about social security, but rather it's made up of several complementary parts. Now, some people talk about this as being three legs on the same stool, and we need to see simultaneous action across these three areas of activity if we're to progress the idea of a minimum income guarantee. But in tackling fair paid work, in looking at our public services to reduce the cost of essentials, and also looking at our social security system, the minimum income guarantee tackles the three key drivers of poverty in Scotland. Now, for most working age adults, we'll meet the minimum income guarantee levels through our paid work alone. But for other households, there's a need for a top-up minimum income guarantee payment to get people to that minimum income level. And for other households where there's caring responsibility, ill health or disability, that social security sphere will be really important in getting people to that minimum income guarantee level. Next slide. Now, I'm conscious that that can still feel a little bit abstract to people, but what we're talking about in practice is reform to the world of work to make it more accessible and equitable. That might mean raising the minimum level of the minimum wage. It might be thinking about how our employability programs can be more squarely focused on progression. In services, this is about reducing the cost of essentials so that the income that people need to reach that dignified standard of life is reduced. That might be through things like a social tariff for energy or increasing the funded childcare entitlement. And then in social security, we are talking about the introduction of a MIG payment, but alongside wider changes that promote adequacy and dignity in the system. So that might mean scrapping the two-child limit or increasing the rate of the Scottish Child Payment. Next slide. Thank you. So do people want this? Well, the Poverty Alliance have been doing a lot of work with our members through a funded project by the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust. And we've found in civil society widespread enthusiasm for the policy at a time where people think this sort of bold action is needed. And that's replicated in public support. So polling by Save the Children and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have found a really strong appetite for change in the general public, and that they feel that politicians are not yet doing enough to tackle child poverty. And as a result of those feelings, 3 in 4 people in Scotland want a minimum income guarantee and think that this is a good policy idea. What we also saw in our work with members was that people really pushed back very strongly on the idea of a minimum income guarantee as a radical policy proposal. They felt that at a time where inadequacy has basically become something of an entrenched norm in our system, when we start to talk about something that's just about giving people enough for a decent standard of living, it feels radical by contrast. But what they felt was that we should instead be framing the minimum income guarantee as a practical proposal to realise our fundamental human rights. And we know that introducing this policy would be costly, but members felt that those costs were justified, particularly when you put them in the broader socio-economic costs of poverty itself. Next slide. So there's been a lot of work going on in Scotland to develop this minimum income guarantee. The Scottish Government established an expert group and a steering group to take forward this commitment. They published an interim report in March 2023 and also published a final report in June of this year. And I really urge you to have a look at that report if you haven't already, because it helps us to set out the parameters and the principles of the minimum income guarantee and basically gets us to a point of thinking about how would this work in practice. Next slide, Andy. Thanks very much. One of the things that the expert group report does, and also the Poverty Alliance have done in our work, is to think about the minimum income guarantee as a roadmap approach. Now, we've found this to be really, really helpful in getting buy-in because it helps people to see this as something tangible and also that's something that can be delivered over time. So when you look at that expert group report, you'll see that they talk about a roadmap to the full minimum income guarantee. So that's the destination that we're trying to get to. But we know that on the road to that destination, there's hundreds of interim steps that would get us closer to embedding the principles of a minimum income guarantee. Now, they talk about the things that would need to happen in the next Parliament to make progress. We're adopting that roadmap in some of our wider policy calls, and that will become the basis of our manifesto for the Scottish Parliament elections. How do we actually make this roadmap implemented in the next Parliament? And final slide there, Andy. Thank you. So I think the fundamental question that we have remaining around the minimum income guarantee is, will it happen and will it work? And we're really clear at the Poverty Alliance that this will only happen if we come together as the public and as civil society to push for it. I'm currently working with a very small group of Poverty Alliance members as a campaign steering group to develop a campaign on the minimum income guarantee, which we'll be launching next month, and happy to share details of that with people on this call. And we'd really love you to be part of that campaign and to see how we make sure that the minimum income guarantee speaks to the social enterprise sector as well. So do get in touch with me. My details are on that final slide there, Andy, if you don't mind skipping through. Do get in touch with me if you want to talk about that further, and really look forward to the discussion today. And thanks again for the invite to be here.
Brilliant, thanks, Ruth. And we'll take up that invite ourselves as well, I think, to engage, I think, certainly, on behalf of social enterprises. So yeah, as I mentioned, if you've got any questions or comments, please do post in the chat or come on camera after the speakers. So we'll hand over to our second speaker now, who is Cleo Goodman from Basic Income Conversation.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk a bit about universal basic income. I'm joining from a project or campaign called Basic Income Conversation that I've been running for the last about half decade, since 2019. So I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with thousands of people about basic income. So some of what I'm saying will be like technical stuff, probably a fair amount of it, because that feels important in this policy conversation, but also infused with this kind of understanding of lots of people's different opinions on basic income, for and against. So the idea of a basic income, I always come to the definition, which has 5 characteristics to kind of conceptualize what basic income is. But more importantly, or ahead of that, it's the idea that everyone should be given an income that meets their basic needs as a right, because they're human and because no one deserves to live, without the kind of access to community, to society that money gives you. So the idea of a universal basic income is that we give everyone a flat rate of payment, which is money, it's cash that people can spend on whatever they want. It's a regular payment, which makes it become an income, so they know when the next payment is coming, they can really depend on that. It's paid to the individual, so this is where it starts to be quite different from the way that things are done in our existing social security system, where it is paid on the household. If paying it to the individual means that everyone, for the first time in history, would have an income of their own. This is quite a feminist principle. It's completely unconditional. So again, this is, I think, I would say the most central component of a basic income is that it's completely without conditions. There is no, there's no sanctions, there's no conditions, there's no work, there's no strings attached. There's a sort of philosophical element to the unconditionality of a basic income, that it's grounded in trust, and that means that it comes without conditions. And then the big one that makes it to the name, where in the way that some people describe a universal basic income, is that it is universal and that everybody gets it. For me, also, on the right-hand side of this slide, I've got a couple of things that I think are really important but aren't in the definition, is that it's redistributive. So it's moving money from places where there are lots, and then via the tax system, it's redistributed from either corporations or individuals that have a lot of wealth and a lot of money, and putting it as income in people's pockets that starts to alleviate things like poverty. And the other thing, that it aspires to be adequate. So this is, on this next slide, where it differs from a minimum income guarantee is that a basic income doesn't have a guarantee of adequacy inherently. It's not built into the universal basic income necessarily, unless you design a basic income to be at a minimum income guarantee level. And this is where it becomes a bit confusing and the policies start to overlap. But I thought I would sort of tease out the differences that I see as most important in between a basic income and a minimum income guarantee. A basic income is a single policy. So it's one payment that everybody would get. It would be one policy that you would roll out. It would so there's a simplicity in it, actually, which is nice to say, because I think usually I don't get to be the simpler policy in these kind of conversations. Whereas in comparison to minimum income guarantee, to me, it's a minimum income guarantee is a very important and very crucial reimagining of our aspirations for our social security system that includes work and services and indeed, the sort of income support policies. So in that way, there is absolutely no conflict between the two. And in fact, I think a basic income could and should be part of a minimum income guarantee. The other key differences are that, as Ruth mentioned, basic income is a flat rate of payment, whereas the minimum income guarantee includes means tested benefits. And the final point, which I mentioned, is a basic income has no guarantee of adequacy, but then a minimum income guarantee, to me, unless it has a universal component, it has no guarantee of universality. So this would be a concern for a minimum income guarantee to me, because if it doesn't have a universal component, we might be leaving behind people, again, that are already left behind by our existing system. So people who no bank account because they're homeless, perhaps, or often women, people with immigrants, etc. So, but yeah, a basic income would always, and it is always conceptualized as fitting within a wider social security system. So again, this is where these things are completely complementary. We would still need services, we would still need healthcare, education, travel, more. It would be silly to have a universal basic income that replaces healthcare, because it would need to be astronomically high, and healthcare is better delivered by a national health service. Work is really key, and work should be good quality, and people should fight for a living wage and for good jobs, but that it sits outside the universal basic income policy and becomes a element for the world of work. We also have these kind of roadmap approaches to a universal basic income, but these would be stepping stones of that single policy. So this is the starter scheme for a modest basic income, which would be £41 a week for children, £63 a week for adults, and £190 for adults over 65. It would be cost neutral. So this is a very affordable policy that is funds raised by minor tweaks to the tax system. The biggest change here would be abolishing the personal allowance to afford this policy, and also the state pension, and some reforms to the benefit system as well. So this would be a very affordable basic income. You could have a much more ambitious basic income by having more ambitious ways of funding it. Like I mentioned, I think there's a real argument for that being very redistributive. So there's new taxes there. But there are also some savings to be made through improved societal health when we eliminate something like poverty through, or perhaps just reduce it with a basic income, but then eliminate it with a minimum income guarantee. That would be how we would afford a basic income that is a bit higher. These policies that I've just mentioned very quickly, which I'm sorry for the speed at which I'm talking about quite specific and technical things there. But if you fancy reading a bit more about these, there's 2 papers that I'm referencing here. But the key thing that I wanted to mention is that this low-level modest basic income would reduce child poverty by more than half. So while it is a simpler policy, it has enormous potential for slicing poverty and reducing it in incredibly large leaps. So perhaps, again, like thinking about where it fits in that roadmap to the more comprehensive approach to a minimum income guarantee and the changes to services and work is fruitful, in my opinion. So I'm running out of time here, but where has a basic income? It's something that's talked about a lot and piloted very widely. This map shows you where it has been piloted. The pilots across the world show us that there are big positive impacts on health and well-being, largely through a pathway of reducing stress. And the big one that often is when I'm having these conversations about basic income with people who are less supportive, people participate in paid work about the same amount when they're receiving a basic income as when they're not. So it doesn't have a massive decrease in the amount of paid work that people do. The only permanent basic income on the planet is, in fact, in Alaska, in the US, which is quite surprising, perhaps, being a sort of red state. But they have had a permanent basic income, which is an annual basic income since the 80s. We got close to piloting a basic income here in Scotland. This is another report that is very interesting to read if you're wanting to learn a bit more about basic income. This pilot unfortunately didn't happen, and we seem to have moved on, but there are here sort of quite enthusiastic conversations about piloting a minimum income guarantee, which I imagine would quite closely resemble a basic income pilot if it was just experimenting with the payments. So something to refer back to when we're talking about things in the current context in Scotland. I'll skip over that. There is an ongoing basic income pilot happening in Wales at the moment. This is a targeted basic income, so the payments are just being made to care leavers, people who, when they were children, were in the care system in Wales. And the final results of this will be published in 2027. So again, some really interesting policy insights for us to look to from Wales there, from that primary evidence of how we could do social security and income support better for care experienced young people in Scotland here. These results will be directly relevant to us here in Scotland. I've mentioned this a little bit, and this is my final thought. I think the key challenges for a minimum income guarantee are in many ways the same as for a universal basic income. Social security is not something that politicians stake their political capital on very much. You know, that everybody knows poverty is bad, but will anyone commit their political capital to spending lots and lots of money on the necessary expensive social security policy that would do meaningful work to reduce poverty? That doesn't seem to have happened after many, many years of austerity. So I think a minimum income guarantee is a very, very important and crucial policy, but the fact that it is lots of different campaigns, in my opinion, I think it's not just one campaign, the framing of it being one thing, I think will be very challenging to build public support around. So that's why I think to argue that a basic income should be a component of it, because that kind of is a very compelling and very popular and very frankly well known, I guess, which is unlikely in social security circles, social security policy. And the fact that it's guaranteeing that no one is left outside the system is sort of requires universality, again, in my opinion, to not replicate the problems in our current system for the most marginalized groups. That's my thought. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cleo. Really, really good. And yeah, we will share the slides with people after, and also the webinar has been recorded. So if anybody feels like they've missed anything at any point after the webinar, they can certainly watch the recording. So I will now hand over to Lukas from Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Policy and Knowledge Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland. And thanks to Duncan for inviting me along to offer some of the reflection on what we've heard and the ideas of around like a minimum income guarantee and universal basic income. So basically, for those of you who don't know us, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a global movement, and I'm working for the Scottish hub of that global movement. And it's basically a collaboration of individuals and organizations who kind of want to redesign our economic system so that it delivers good lives for all on a healthy planet. And basically what brings people together to support us and work on this field is the kind of recognition that it's the kind of the way we've designed our economic system that is at the root cause of a lot of the environmental and social problems that we're facing, but also the kind of hopeful message that means we can redesign it, we can set it up differently to tackle these challenges. I guess in many ways we don't necessarily have the how that's done is very different, very context dependent. We don't have a blueprint, but we do have some kind of shared principles that we've developed with members around the world. And these are kind of, because some call them well-being needs, these are the kind of things we think our economy should be designed to deliver, and that's dignity, purpose, nature, participation, and fairness. And I will not go into all of them in the interest of time, but you will see at the top there is dignity. So it's that idea that in a well-being economy, everyone would have enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness, which very much chimes with the kind of ideas we've heard in the first two presentations. I would say in overall, like in the global movement, we don't necessarily have one specific policy proposition of how we would achieve that. In Scotland, we support generally the minimum income guarantee and a lot of the great work that, you know, Ruth and Poverty Alliance and other organizations have done on this. But in the same way, as Cleo has said, we don't necessarily say that it's like that I would exclude a universal basic income. And I thought it would be useful from a kind of global perspective to also outline a little bit of the wider landscape. And there tends to be like about three ways of looking at this, that are three broad policy areas that are floating around in terms of how we can solve that dignity challenge. And I would say generally the idea is that none of them are kind of can do that on their own, but that it's kind of the possibly combination or kind of more complex suite of policies that we need. But we've already heard about the universal basic income, so there's a lot of support in that. And then the other two are like universal basic services and the job guarantee. And I think they all have like different advantages and disadvantages, which make them quite complementary in my view. Like, for example, Cleo was done a good job at outlining the power of the universal basic income, that it's universal, it's quite simple, it's quite a powerful idea. But I think the kind of, but it's only looking at that side. It's not looking at the production of necessities side. And I think especially how we make sure that, essentials are affordable and kind of eliminate things like rent extraction from the system. So if you just, I don't know, for example, pay universal basic income, then landlords might think, oh, I can put up the rent because people have the money to pay for it, and then you have to pay them more. And so you need to kind of look at both sides of that, which is kind of where the universal basic services idea comes in. There's quite a lot of work on that around as well, and that's the idea that we provide basically for free or very cheap a lot of basic necessities to everyone, whether that is housing, transport, energy, broadband. So kind of expanding the principle that we use for healthcare and education into other areas as well, and that would be delivered by non-for-profit, either by the government or by like social enterprises, cooperatives such as many are on this call. But again, that then has the disadvantage that it's not as flexible. People have different needs, and you haven't got that cash component in terms of people being able to spend it on the things that are most important for them. And then the last one to mention is the job guarantee. I put it in brackets because it's not something we explicitly support as WEAll Scotland at the moment, mostly because we think that the risk of doing it badly are too big as long as we haven't got the other components of the universal basic income and the universal basic services in place. But I think if it's done well, can be quite a powerful complement to that suite. And there's been a really interesting experiment I read about in Austria, where if you do it, that it's completely voluntary, so only people who really want it, and you give them a lot of support, and you design the jobs around the passion and skills that people have, it can be quite a powerful policy. But again, if you haven't got that in place, and that voluntary aspect is, I think, a big risk that it can slide into something that goes more into like forced labor or old Victorian workhouses type thing. At the moment, I feel like we're not quite there to advocate that as a policy. But basically, I think that's the reason why we support the minimum income guarantee, which Ruth has laid out, because it tackles these kind of three aspects. It looks at the work aspect, it looks at the kind of services and the cost of essentials, and it looks at the kind of social security aspect as well. And I think my final reflection to this is, from our perspective, in terms of redesigning the economy, these first two are really important, and there is a danger, not just from us, but also from others, that the discussion also slides and sticks to the benefit bit, and we don't talk as much about the kind of looking at the cost and delivery of services and work. And I think that can actually be an aspect that potentially can really make us more popular to a much wider range of people. But yeah, like I read an article, I think it was the Scottish Mirror recently, that was very scathing about the minimum income guarantee, and they got quite a few things wrong. But one of the things is that they were absolutely focused just on the kind of benefit aspect of it. It didn't really pick up on any of the other things. So I will leave it there.
Great, thanks, Lukas. And we'll now hand over to our final speaker, who's Stephen from the think tank IPPR Scotland.
Okay, thanks, Duncan, and thanks, Andy, for the invitation to participate today. It's been a great discussion so far. I should at the outset apologise for my embarrassingly amateurish slide pack compared to my predecessors. But if you could just jump onto the first slide, please, Duncan. So IPPR Scotland, we are an independent think tank stroke charity. We're helping to shape policy in pursuit of a fairer, greener and more prosperous Scotland. I'll not run through the rest of this slide, but if you want to find out more about who we are and what we do, I've got the website address at the bottom. So you'll find all our quite extensive research on issues around about minimum income guarantee, social security, poverty, etc. on the website. If you could just jump to the next slide, please, Duncan. So I think we've missed one there. If you go back like that. So just want to provide a wee bit of context to my comments specifically on UBI MIG. So this is a slide, Ruth's probably seen me share this a couple of times before, but I like using this slide because I worry at the moment that very often, a lot of conversations I hear denigration of the welfare state, even from people on the kind of progressive left. it's almost as if we get the kind of work side of the equation right, then we don't really need the welfare state. And I think this very simple graphic provides a good illustration of why we need it. We need the welfare state to provide income to those who don't receive income from the market. It's as simple as that. The capitalist system, if you want to put it like that, only distributes income to workers and owners. So we need to have another way of distributing income to those who don't earn from the market. And I'm sure most people on the call get that, but I mean, I think it is increasingly lost from some conversations, and it's really important to stress that no amount of pre-distribution, as we call it, but measures that we might take to affect market outcomes, no amount of pre-distribution will provide non-workers with adequate incomes. Only the welfare state can do that, and I think it's really important to be clear on that point. Just next slide, please, Duncan. Just wanted to provide a wee bit of additional context here. So here's poverty rates for OECD. I found out yesterday that actually putting Scottish poverty rates into international context is incredibly complex because of the way we calculate these things. So it's only the UK appears on this chart, but you can see that UK poverty rates are around about double those in Denmark and Finland. Scotland is slightly better by this measure, but not a great deal. So you can see that other countries using other systems manage to achieve much different and better outcomes, I would argue, than we're able to achieve here. And one of the reasons why, if you just jump on to the next slide. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but it makes a really important point, I think. So this looks at replacement rates. This is the money that you will receive if you lose your job. So you might have been earning £500 a week beforehand. If you're made unemployed, what will you receive through unemployment benefit, housing benefit, and other forms of social assistance? So these figures relate to people who were previously earning 100% of the average wage. They've been unemployed for 2 months, unless otherwise stated, and here's what they receive. So the UK figures are highlighted, and what you can see is replacement rates in the UK are catastrophically low in European terms. The only other advanced country that kind of is around about the same ballpark area is, it will not surprise you to learn, the United States. But if you look at, particularly for single people, after you've been unemployed for 2 months, in the UK, you're receiving 34% of your previous income. In Denmark, it's 65%, Spain, 64%, France, 68%, Netherlands, nearly 75%. So you can see the kind of, the failure of the UK regime at this moment in time. Things improve over time. So if you've been unemployed for 25 months, then UK is still low, but not quite as low as some other countries, even although, there are others that are getting on to nearly double in terms of generosity. So it's just a good illustration, I think, of the failures of the current UK social security regime. So if you just jump on to the next slide, Duncan, please. So just some thoughts on sorry, Duncan, you've got a dialogue box open there. If you could maybe remove that, would be great, thanks. So here's just some of my thoughts. Hopefully this will start to get a bit of a debate going, but some of my thoughts on basic income or minimum income guarantee. So essentially universal basic income. I've been around this kind of area for about 20 years now. It's kind of been a constant there. There's always been people who've pushed this. I used to be very friendly with Thales Mackay, who some of you might have heard of, was a professor at Glasgow Caledonian University. UBI was her big thing before she sadly passed away. But I remember debating this with her 15 years ago, so it's been something that's always been around. But my kind of key line on this, and it's one that's been repeated elsewhere, is an affordable UBI would, I think, be inadequate in terms of the challenges we face. An adequate UBI would be unaffordable. And the report I've linked there is the one that Cleo put up earlier on as well, and that provides some figures about what a UBI would cost in Scotland. I should have made a note of those figures. I don't have them to hand, but certainly what I would describe as an adequate UBI would be in the tens of billions in Scotland. And the world in which I'm living in at the moment, where you're having to fight tooth and nail for any additional spend on any policy, that just seems, I'm afraid, somewhat realistic. I think the politics are just always challenging around about this. Raising tax is always extremely hard, as we see that in Scotland. And I think the why give rich people money argument, although we might in this call regard that as not a particularly serious argument, is one that has some purchase and it's difficult to overcome, I think. So my view would be that it's very difficult to see how UBI can ever be politically feasible at a level that would realise the full administrative and emancipatory benefits claimed by its advocates. So, I mean, a lot of the kind of benefits you hear applied to UBIs, how it would free people up to make better decisions, choose not to work if they wanted not to work, etc. Well, to achieve those benefits, it has to be set at a level that I cannot see how could ever be politically feasible. I mean, it was interesting, Cleo referred to we nearly got there in terms of pilot in Scotland, and I'm not sure we did. The government made some commitments, spent a bit of money in research. I'm not convinced they were ever serious about a serious pilot. And I think, again, a lot of the pilots we've seen round about the world, are they serious tests of UBI? I'm not entirely sure they are. I think lots of them are just tests of various forms of labour market conditionality, and I don't think we learn that much from them. So, and I think another point, we heard a lot about UBI during COVID, and Nicola Sturgeon, who's somewhat in the news at the moment, I remember her saying that, we need to be thinking about UBI as a solution to the problems we're facing at that time. I mean, I just think that's plain wrong. I mean, unless set again at very high level, UBI just does not protect from a catastrophic drop in income. So the rhetoric was wrong. The situation called for income replacement. It didn't call for a UBI, and a UBI, I would argue, at that moment in time would have been practically useless. But nevertheless, I mean, I don't, there are worse things to argue for than a UBI. And I think it would help address the fundamental asymmetries of economic power that lead to a lot of the problems that we've discussed today. If people were receiving, again, I'm a bit more sceptical. UBI set at the kind of rates that Cleo was talking about. They're set at higher rates. It certainly would increase worker bargaining power, and I think that would absolutely be a good thing. And I think it's important to stress that universality is a very sound principle, and it does underpin the best welfare regimes around the world and the most successful economies, I would say, as well. But UBI, I'm afraid, I think is a distraction from the immediate challenges that we face. Next slide, please, Duncan. So, Mike, I should stress it out outside here. I'm not really a neutral authority here because the MIG was IPPR Scotland's idea originally, a report that we published in 2021. I've only been with IPPR Scotland for the last year, so I came very late to this, but it is something we've been heavily involved in, our members of the expert group, etc. So, I mean, I can't claim to be neutral in this regard. I think it's fair to say that MIG is more politically feasible than UBI, but it's also more complex. Though I think it is possible, again, as others have alluded to exaggerate the extent of the differences. And the extent of those differences really depends on the precise design of the UBI in the mix that we're talking about. There has been and continues to be genuine interest from the Scottish Government and other parties. Nevertheless, it does remain immensely challenging in the current fiscal environment. So the expert group report, for instance, is talking about doubling the Scottish child payment by 2030, I think I'm right in saying, Ruth, 2031. I mean, that would cost round about an additional £1 billion. So, I mean, I think that is a very good use of an additional £1 billion, and I would argue for it, but nevertheless, winning that argument at the moment is incredibly difficult. And the one point I would, gently challenge around about how MIG is presented is, I don't think it does provide financial security for all. Without the insurance element that underpins most other European social security regimes, if you're earning average or higher incomes and you lose your job, the MIG might provide a better safety net than you have at the moment, but it doesn't really retain your financial security. You're likely to lose that as long as those replacement rates remain round about the ones we discussed earlier. Next slide, please, Duncan. I'm aware of trying to finish up quickly here. So, I mean, I worry sometimes that we get distracted by big ideas and, we can lose sight of some quick wins that we can have, or, more winnable political battles, I think. So I think there is much more that can be achieved in the current paradigm, if you want to put it like that. So the asymmetries of economic power I just mentioned can at least be partially addressed through the employment bill measures that are going through the UK Parliament at the moment. We could, if we chose to, index working age benefits to wages, as already pretty much happens with pensioners through triple lock, and that would help tie the economic fortunes of those out of work or in work and receiving benefits to the economic fortunes of the country as a whole. We could absolutely abolish the 2-child limit. I remain cautiously optimistic that might happen through this Parliament, but I'm certainly not putting any money on it. we could fix the insurance problem. And to be fair, I mean, I was not a fan, as you can imagine, of the recent welfare white paper, but the better aspects of it were round about increasing unemployment benefits and spending more on labour market measures such as training, support, rehabilitation. We could essentially make the system more European if we chose to do that. And we could, through a variety of measures, some of which are kind of happening at the moment, reduce housing and energy costs. So final slide, Duncan. Very quickly, final thoughts. First one, we haven't today, but we often hear technological change as a reason why we should be thinking about a universal basic income or a MIG. I just think this is nonsense, frankly. Our problem at the moment is we've got too few people, not too many. I mean, I can't see any credible state of the world where we're going to need to have, introduce radical measures to deal with widespread technological unemployment, despite a lot of what you might read about how AI is affecting the labour market. Just ain't going to happen. The second point, I'll not read these all out, but I just think it's vitally important that any of the solutions to the big challenges we face at country at the moment have to have credible funding plans attached, or they'll prove practically useless. I spend most of my days at this moment in time making arguments for progressive policy, but having to address the spending, the revenue side at the same time. And final point, other countries achieve much better outcomes than we do in terms of poverty and inequality, in terms of economic outcomes. They do so without a UBI or a MIG. Rather, they tend to have generous out-of-work benefits, they've got excellent universal services, and they spend heavily on labour market measures. We can learn from them. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Sorry, I was just closing multiple windows there, etc. So that's really good, actually. So we've got a really good debate, I think, already around these different measures and related measures as well. So I think there's a lot for us to digest there. So we're very aware that there is a lot of information as well just been provided by our four speakers. So as I mentioned, this is recorded, so you can watch this again after, as well as we'll be sharing the slides as well, if that's okay with our speakers. So would anybody like to come on camera and ask a question at this stage? So there is a question in the chat, which I can come to first, but do put your hand up if you have a question as well. So it's basically a question to all the speakers, and it's really about, this is one of our key questions actually, is about working with other organizations, especially local organizations, and obviously from our perspective, social enterprises, to fight poverty on the ground, but I guess to kind of, embed or talk about some of these policies as well. So how do you do that, or how can we do that really? So there's some examples here. One's working in poverty like CFINE in Aberdeen, Foyer in Aberdeen, actually two really good examples there. So any of our speakers want to come back on that first point about how we work, I guess, with local organizations, local communities? Maybe that's the way to see it.
I'm happy to take that first,
Yeah,
Duncan. I think that's a really important question. And at the Poverty Alliance, as a membership organisation, we have a geographically dispersed membership across Scotland, and it's really important to us that we're being able to reach out to those organisations that are on the ground, because we know that all too often it's those organisations that are on the front line of efforts to tackle poverty, and those organisations also don't always have the capacity or the resource to be working on the sort of policy advocacy work that my team do, but they have the evidence and the passion that's really important to be bringing into those campaigns. So that's a really big part of our work. Did some work with CFINE last year actually on their poverty conference that they did. And I think just to mention here as well that we have another campaign called Scotland Demands Better, which is on the go at the moment, which is trying to build to a national demonstration on poverty in Edinburgh on the 25th of October. And a key part of that work is trying to work with local communities to mobilise them to be part of that campaign. So very happy to speak to Rachel, who asked that question about how we can bring her organisation into that. We're working with CFINE, SHMOO and the Aberdeen Trades Council to organise a local meeting in Aberdeen to try and get organisations interested in part of that campaign. So really happy to chat to Rachel about that, or any other organisations on this call. But I think those community-based organisations rooted in local communities are absolutely critical to actually being able to tackle poverty.
Great. And I think we're happy to be obviously the conduit between those conversations as well, if you want us to as well. So any of the organizations, any speakers here, you want to speak to social enterprises about any of this, and get in touch. Any of our other speakers want to come back on that particular point?
Yeah, just
Cleo?
to mention the toolkit that we have to talk about basic income. So like a sort of structure for a conversation about basic income is kind of the primary way that we work with grassroots groups. Yeah, I mean, funding for campaigning on basic income is very, very thin on the ground. It's been challenging to keep the project going. But most of the big work that we have done has been in collaboration with organizations working on the ground, and it's come from like really personal interest in the simplicity and the comprehensiveness of a universal basic income, and the idea that poverty can be solved by just giving people that don't have money, the very foundation of the idea of a welfare state, but through the lens of a UBI. So we've done a couple of bigger projects working to design kind of demonstrations or pilots of basic income in local spaces. That has been in England. It was in Jarrow in the northeast, and East Finchley that is in the north of London. But yeah, the toolkit's kind of the main way, and it's there for anyone to use however they like. And yeah, we can support with that if desired.
Brilliant. Any of our other speakers want to come back on that particular point as well?
Yeah, I can come in. I guess the honest answer is, we've got quite a small team. Most of our work is focused on the national level, and we got and kind of poverty and this dignity side is only one of the areas we work in. But we do have quite an exciting project which we're just starting up, which is going to be kind of on housing and the kind of economic roots of the housing crisis and kind of around that one. And we will do some work with a kind of lived experience panel on that as well, which is part of that in West Lothian, which I think we're just kind of designing and starting that at the moment, but that's going to be very interesting. And we also have done a fair bit of work in Perth and Kinross Council, working there, looking at the kind of budgeting approach around poverty and well-being with the council and the local community in Latham and Perth.
Brilliant. Stephen, do you want to?
Yeah, very quickly. So, I mean, like Lukas, we're a very small team, mainly concerned with national level policy issues. But I mean, what we do try to do in terms of undertaking our research, so two recent examples would be the work we've done in child maintenance and what we've done in a minimum income guarantee for carers. We try and ensure that lived experience is at the heart of those research projects. And we're also giving a lot of thought at the moment to how we can work with both communities of interest and local communities to involve them in how we define our research questions and how we undertake the research. But that works in its quite early days.
Great. And I suppose, yeah, I mean, Stephen, obviously you laid down a number of, I suppose, challenges there to the affordability point, I think, as well, particularly in terms of universal basic income. I'm just wondering if any of our, Cleo or Ruth want to come back on any of these points just about affordability. I just think that comes up quite a lot, doesn't it, in these conversations around affordability. So it's quite an important one if you want to comment on that at all.
I mean, my main bugbear with what you said is the idea that an affordable basic income is inadequate. Like, I think when you look at the modelling on the reductions in poverty on affordable basic incomes, I just don't think that, I think that argument has been at least slightly disproven, maybe not disproven for some people, but challenged very robustly. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the idea that more can be done in the short term, that has higher impact. The phasing of things I think is totally key, and I completely, I think the big ideas are actually really complementary to the short term wins. I think you have to use ideas like a minimum income guarantee or a universal basic income to talk in a direct enough way to the problems that as we are still leaving people, our policy still leaves people in poverty, which is completely unacceptable. There are pie in the sky too simplistic framings of what they are, but they can be, build that public support that I think is essential to building the political capital to actually having the willingness to these short-term wins. So I think it's, and the reverse of that is the messaging around the welfare state that has been the prevalent one for the last 15, 20 years, which is just about giving wasters money to sit on and do nothing with, which is completely fundamentally inaccurate. And I thought it was beautiful the way you articulated the point in the welfare state of, nothing distributes income to non-workers unless we have a welfare state, and that's why we need to protect it. So telling the stories of why it needs to be protected, letting people speak for themselves about what it's like to be left with absolutely nothing, as the current system does. Those are the people that that I spend all my time speaking to, and that I have for the last half a decade. And those simple ideas resonate, and those stories come out when you frame it as okay, well, what if you had an unconditional income of enough to live off of? And that isn't policy, but that's not the role of a campaigner. That's not the role of a campaign. The role of a campaign is to build interest and passion and accountability to policymakers that then make the policy decisions that should be good and strategic and short term. But I think these things need to be seen as complementary, which, you know, is why it's great to speak to, you know, we have complementary approaches, right, in this room, but I think ultimately our role out with government and out with policymaking is to hold people to account on what decisions need to be made short term, but with the fundamental long-term objective of eliminating poverty, which, back to the affordability question, is always going to be really, really expensive.
Again, there's various things we can be united on around eliminating poverty, I think, as well. It's probably pretty agreeable there. Ruth, do you want to go on?
Thank you, Duncan. And yeah, just picking up on Cleo's later point there, I think we're using the minimum income guarantee as our sort of overarching policy lens that gives us the ability to frame our other policy calls underneath that umbrella of the minimum income guarantee. And I think we have a very big challenge on our hands in the way that Stephen outlined in terms of the entrenched nature of poverty. And I think we do need that sort of long-term vision that we can point to, something that changes the social contract to say this is where we're trying to get to embed that hope that we actually can organise things differently. And I think the minimum income guarantee helps to meet the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And I also think it answers that question that we often face as campaigners, where we sometimes have a one policy call. So for example, increasing the Scottish Child Payment to £25. And then when we achieved that, as a bunch of campaigners, you get together and you're like, well, what do we call for next? And you have to then pivot to the next thing. Whereas the minimum income guarantee gives us that ready-made roadmap. If you win the £40 Scottish Child Payment, you're on to the next part of that roadmap. And I think it gives us that ready-made template for how we campaign to tackle poverty. But all that being said, Stephen's very stark warnings on the difficult fiscal environment are absolutely the case. And I think never more so than right at this moment, if you're at a parliamentary committee and you mention a policy in passing, the question is, how much will that cost? How will you pay for it? What will you stop doing in order to pay for this policy call? And a lot of that should be questions for our political leaders, but Stephen is right that in the build up to the Scottish Parliament elections, it's very, very challenging to get these big policy calls adopted by parties because they are so focused on the fiscal environment. So we do really need to have costings. We need to be able to look to the tax system on what can be done there to actually raise revenue. And I think we need to be honest about also the financial cost of poverty. And Stephen's IPPR has done some excellent work on that. So looking at the fact our health boards spend £2.3 billion on the impacts of poverty every single year, that CPAG tell us that the cost of child poverty to the UK economy every year is £39 billion. And when you put things in that context, spending £3 billion to scrap the two-child limit feels like a very simple decision to make. So I think we do need to be very alive to that financial context, but I also don't think we can let it prevent us from calling for the policy solutions that we know meet the scale of the challenge.
I guess that's a policy default as well, as like what can't we do rather than what can we do. I think that's what they explain in policy circles in general, isn't it? Like we hear that from politicians all the time. Lukas, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm actually was just reflecting and maybe slightly challenging the point that Stephen made about that, you know, there's no redistribution that can change what welfare state does. And that's not really, I think the welfare state is very important, but I do think there are, like, if you think about redistributing ownership of businesses and stuff, there are ways you can, you know, provide benefits to people that are not working, that are more fairer, which might not necessarily be talked about as the welfare state, if that makes sense. Like, I think the example in Alaska is maybe the best example, but I guess, as I said, that's maybe a technical point, but what has sparked that in me is really whether, you know, what exactly we talk counts as a welfare state and what wouldn't count as a welfare state, and whether there's room there to open up discussions that are not, because at the end of the day, we need to appeal to people with this who are, like, for us, it's the main reason is to tackle poverty. But I was wondering whether there are other aspects that, you know, make it more broadly available. And one of the things I've been kind of reflecting on is the kind of, which is in the title of this webinar, is the kind of freedom element of it. Like at the moment, there's a lot of people who work jobs they don't really want to do because it's the only way they can earn money. And kind of especially if you have a more flexible system which opens up more opportunities for you to earn money, whether it's you get a UBI or something and then you go away and do your own job, or whether you get paid because you do unpaid care, or whether you actually do want a normal job in a private sector business. So I feel like, yeah, emphasizing these elements, I wonder whether anybody has done work on that in terms of whether that is something that can open up the discussion to kind of a wider population kind of question.
Yeah, very good point. Sorry, I was just trying to share the poll there for the webinar, so I may have just messed that up. This is why it's better when Andy's here as well to help out. So there's just a quick poll just to say, have you found today's session informative? So if you just literally click on that, hopefully that should come up on your screens just now, and just a couple of questions about policy, if that's okay to do that. Yes, we're coming.
Duncan, sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
I can't work
yeah.
out. Yeah, I can't work out how to put my hand up in.
Don't worry, no, it's fine.
Zoom.
It's fine.
I'm a
Don't need
Teams
to. It's
person.
fine.
So I just want to quickly go back on that. I mean, just about to reassure Lucas that I didn't say, or I certainly didn't want to suggest that nothing can be achieved through pre-distributive measures. I think a lot of the stuff that's contained in the employment bill at the moment, particularly provisions in the sectoral collective bargain, are absolutely pre-distributive and extremely important. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, but we will still need a welfare state at the end of it. That was my only point. I just want to come back quickly on a couple of points. So, I mean, I wouldn't like my presentation to be read as that we shouldn't be coming forward with big ideas. We absolutely need them, and I couldn't agree more with Cleo about that. I'm delighted she's out there doing what she's doing. I might disagree with aspects of it, but I think the work is really important and would want to stress that. Couldn't agree more with Cleo also on just the way we have lost as a nation the ability to discuss the welfare state sensibly, and the consequences have been really appalling. We're now in a kind of firmly in a them and us paradigm where we're led to believe that we pay into the welfare state and other people take from it, but actually over the life cycle we all pay in and we all benefit, and we need to get back to these basics. And again, just in the back of what Ruth said, again, I would like my contribution to be read as we can't do anything. It's going to cost money. There's lots we can do through the tax system to fund progressive measures. We just have to be much better at designing the tax system to support those progressive measures. If anybody wants to fund IPPR Scotland to do any work in a long-term tax strategy for Scotland, I'm more than up for it.
We could get together and bid for funding maybe and some of this. So I guess, yeah, we're coming towards the end of the time just now. We haven't really got the debate going in a sense, really, have we? Because we've had the presentations, but there's 1,000 other questions we could be asking. But again, I always say this at webinars, this isn't the end of the discussion. This is the beginning as well. It's an ongoing discussion. I'm happy for us to have these conversations, on an ongoing basis, as well as in future webinars as well, which we will be promoting at some point soon before the election. So just to say again, thank you to all our speakers today. I think that's really, really good in terms of the diversity of perspectives. And it is a real debate, I think, as well. I think that's really important to emphasize. Well, this is a really important policy debate, and it's something we will obviously revisit as well. Happy to have the conversation with you guys again. Sorry if not everybody had a chance to ask any questions, but at a future webinar, I promise there will be more room for debate. Maybe we'll have a webinar for 2 hours or something, because we could go on for hours with this debate, I guess. So, but thank you again. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to everybody coming along today. Really appreciate your time, and have a good day.